Hello and welcome to Dateline London. I'm Jane Hill. This week we are discussing Ireland's growing fears about the Brexit negotiations. What should the world be doing about the crisis in Venezuela and in North Korea? And is the Duke of Edinburgh setting the tone for us all, not retiring until the age of 96? My guests this week. Not quite 96, any of us. David Aronovich is with me, columnist with The Times. Brian O'Connell, the Irish writer and broadcaster. The Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani. And Michael Goldfarb, the founder of the podcast FRDH, First Rough Draft of History. A very warm welcome to all of you. So, the Brexit negotiations are on hold for the summer holidays. No more talks for the next few weeks. But that hasn't stopped the new Irish Prime Minister expressing his anxieties about the future. Leo Varadkar made an outspoken speech in Belfast this week and called for unique solutions to preserve the relationship between the UK and the European Union after Britain leaves. Well, Brian, you are not long back from Dublin, I think. Just how worried is the administration, do you feel?
It's a distinct change of tone from Enda Kenny's time. Leo Varadkar has decided, I think probably correctly, to kind of distance himself from the UK in these things. Enda Kenny had at the beginning of since the referendum was held, Enda Kenny has said to the other EU members, we are very close to Britain, we can help Britain through this. Now you get Leo Varadkar, who is saying, in fact, well, Britain better get on with it, the border. They have to come up with solutions. And in politics, as everyone around this table knows, words are important. So what does a seamless border mean? What does it mean if you can't trade the way you used to? What does it mean if, for example, the customs union isn't there anymore?
I mean, he's clearly very worried about trade. I mean, that was one of the key things he was talking about.
It's absolutely crucial. I mean, this is not new, but the way in which the Irish government's concerns are being expressed is new.
Is new, yes.
It's far harsher, yes.
Yes, yeah. Michael, your take on it?
Well, it's interesting because there's two things. There's the border, the economic border, which seems to be gone. There's the more abstract and metaphysical border, which has divided the island since independence and was the source of the low-grade civil war that went on, the Troubles. And that seemed to be having less importance, and now it's suddenly important again. So there's that border. But there's another border, which is Irish goods usually come by ferry over into the island of Britain, and then they go across Britain, and then they go on into the continent. And if that changes, how will Irish goods get to market on the continent? It means a much longer sea voyage, doesn't it? Unless they can arrange some kind of customs thing that you land at Holyhead and then you exit at Dover. I mean, how does that
what the Irish call the land bridge, where if you want to ship goods by road to France, you can go on a ferry from Rosslare over to France. But as you say, it's a much longer journey. And the problem that they have will be that land bridge. If Britain is no longer in the customs union, you won't be able to build a car park big enough at Holyhead or Dover to do the paperwork. It's as simple as that. It will. I mean, for example, Ireland's food industry is the first in the firing line. It has been since the referendum, since the devaluation in sterling. It's very, very difficult to grow and produce in euros and sell it on British supermarkets in sterling without taking a hell of a hit. I mean, for most Irish food producers, I think the hit's been about 18% so far.
David, your take on, I mean, is he speaking up now precisely perhaps because it is August and he thinks, right, there's no more negotiations in theory for a few more weeks, I'm jolly well going to have my say? I mean, he was expressing real frustration, wasn't he?
I think everybody is incredibly frustrated with Britain. I mean, it's quite obvious that the European negotiators are frustrated with Britain. It always was a problem after the Brexit vote, the degree to which not only Britain could actually create a deal which gave it the things that it thought it wanted, which were some of which were incompatible, within a kind of structure that suited other people as well. Why should European countries trust a British government, a British Prime Minister, to be able to deliver on Europe, given the politics about Europe in Britain, given that almost no Prime Minister, certainly no Conservative Prime Minister, is in a position to deliver on Europe because of the splits within the Conservative Party? It wasn't for the splits in the Conservative Party. We wouldn't have done this in the first place. We wouldn't have had the referendum, we wouldn't have had Brexit, and we wouldn't have spent the last year dicking around trying to get to absolutely nowhere.
But we are where we are, and the government would say, well, we do have this mandate and we will go and keep continuing to negotiate in Brussels because that's what we have to do. We have to make it work.
So here's my first challenge. We're not where we are.
No, and there's a veiled threat in what Leo Varadkar has been saying, which is if we get to the October summit and we don't think that enough progress has been made on Ireland and the other issues, citizens' rights and the financial settlement the UK has to discuss. If there hasn't been enough progress on Ireland by then, we can't move on to the next stage until there is. And that is the threat that Britain now faces.
Yes, and the fact is that despite what Philip Hammond says, Brexit will in fact affect every department of life. It's going to be a major headache. It's going to affect everything from trade to security and indeed agricultural and fishery policies. Ireland certainly doesn't think that it will be a smooth, experience, nor do the rest of us. And dare I say, one of the most perhaps predictable developments of Brexit is the record number of British people applying for Irish passports. Hundreds of thousands of applications are being made in the UK and across Europe and indeed in the rest of the world. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there aren't quite a few Brexiteers amongst the applicants, showing just how important it is to get Britain's relationship with Ireland.
We have no way of knowing that, of course. We have no way of knowing that. And people
Where is George Osborne's baronetcy? Isn't it from Ireland? It is, I believe.
Yes, we think so.
But I think it just shows that having your cake and eating it is the primary motivation of many leavers, and sadly the fact that the Irish question is now emerging with such force proves that having your cake and eating it isn't really a very credible option. And just as crucially, the relationship between Ulster and the Irish Republic has been very stable for over the recent years, but now the troubles can blow up again.
And it's not helped by the fact that there is no power-sharing government in place in Northern
and by
Ireland
the fact that the DUP is now arguably the closest ally of Theresa May's government.
Yes, and we talked a lot about trade, and that was one of Leo Varadkar's key concerns. But a quick final thought from you, Brian, on this in terms of the peace process, if we call it that, or certainly the power-sharing government in relation to Brexit.
The two governments, the British government and the Irish government, are guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's quite a complicated structure. It took a long time to negotiate, and I don't think that the British government is paying enough attention to the detail of that, the north-south structures that they have in place. That's the political part of it, but the economic part of it is the trade across that border, and you cannot have a technical solution to it. You know, as they say, for example, you can pay your customs duties in the same way as you pay your toll by just having a barcode in the windscreen of the truck and this kind of thing. But ask anybody in Ireland what happens if you put a very small camera on top of a very, very tall pole on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
We will return to this, I'm quite sure, and Brexit negotiations, as we say, get back underway at the end of August and then building up to that summit that was mentioned, of course, in October. So that will come up plenty in the coming months. Let's turn our attentions a little bit further afield, because there were major international developments in two areas this week, Venezuela and North Korea. Let's start with Venezuela, though, because that controversial new assembly, packed with allies of the unpopular president, Nicolas Maduro, held its inaugural session this week amid widespread international criticism of its legitimacy. The election that brought it in was marred by violence, of course, we talked about it here, and allegations of fraud. David, how should the rest of the world be responding to what we've witnessed in Venezuela, particularly in the last few weeks?
It's actually very difficult for the rest of the world to respond. There aren't actually any sort of significant levers of pressure. I mean, what do you do? The sanctions against Maduro and the leading people in his party and the leading figures of the government, who are the people who are most significantly responsible for what's going on and for the descent of Venezuela into dictatorship, you can sanction them personally, and that might hit them personally, but it's not going to alter what they do, because the problem with them is they are now so completely invested in the process of taking Venezuela towards away from any form of democracy, and the place is in such a mess that actually, were they to lose power, they would almost certainly be indicted, eventually go to prison for a very long time. So unless somebody is actually going to offer Maduro and his friends a sort of lovely refuge somewhere with lots of money on a sun-kissed island, it's quite difficult to see what the inducements are that you can create for them. I think what the outside world has to do is to give assistance to those people trying to help the Venezuelan people directly themselves, human rights organisations and so on, to try and mitigate the worst effects of what's going on. And if the position comes about that the outside world in some way can offer its services as some form of negotiating body to help with the peaceful transition, then in that case that's what it's got to do. But what there is no scope for is any significant intervention in the affairs of Venezuela. That won't make things better, and I don't think anybody's going to do it.
Michael?
Well, I think that from what I know of the country, what's interesting to follow is that for all of the demonstration, you haven't had the disintegration, and you haven't had people retreating into the hills armed and forming an insurgency to try and overthrow the government. The people who are resisting Maduro's moves towards dictatorship are, using the right to assembly, and they're being shot down in that as they protest. It's a very strange unfolding, and I also think that it is sui generis. There was a time in Latin America where there were a lot of left-wing authoritarian regimes, right-wing authoritarian regimes, and people went to the hills. That's not happening now. Just adjacent, you have Colombia, which has recently, come to some kind of arrangement, the government, with the FARC, and it has reached a kind of post-conflict situation, as we have in Northern Ireland. Whereas in Venezuela, it seems to be trapped in some early 1970s time warp. I agree with David that there's not much the outside world can do, and the traditional allies of that regime, Cuba is going through transition. I mean, there was a time a decade ago when Chavez was still in power. They were having economic problems. The Cuban government was able to send over doctors. They were able to help aid the Bolivarian revolution. That's not happening now. And I do fear that there's many steps to go, but it's an internal process. And I feel for my contacts in Venezuela, I've reported from there, who are just kind of stuck in that kind of terrible situation of 80, 90% inflation. Whatever they've accumulated in their lives is worthless, and they're stuck. It's a terrible situation.
It's a long way to run. That's what you're suggesting, Nabila.
Yes, but I think what strikes me is the way people in Britain appear to take a particular interest in Venezuela, because Jeremy Corbyn made some vague noises about the country and suggesting that he was a supporter of Maduro. Corbyn is pretty quiet at the moment, and the main reason for that is because he's undoubtedly as baffled by the real situation there as we all are. And it's very clear that Venezuela has been administered in an absolutely appalling manner for decades, and policies have failed, and the state could descend into civil war and outright disaster. What is wrong, however, is to look at a hugely complicated socio-political situation through what I would call the Trump prism, meaning that the events in Venezuela are being simplified into a contest between old right-wingers and Corbyn-style leftists, and the idea is that we're meant to pick our side according to old Cold War cliches framed by a propaganda war. But the reality is that there have always been endemic problems in South American societies, and the real problems are not necessarily caused by governments, but they are also caused by a few families and indeed cartels who amass all the wealth. And this creates huge problems as far as the fabric of South American societies is concerned, and it takes far more sophisticated solutions to deal with that than simply having a left-right about political argument and, seeing the whole thing in isolation. This is a classic Trump view of the world, presenting things as if they were completely new, as if we were in year dot, and as if this has never happened before. Trump does it with everything. He does it with immigration, he does it with terrorism, and this is frankly a far from impressive approach to the whole issue.
Well, let's move away from Trump. It's quite hard to do on any given week, but we will endeavour to do so. If we feel we can't, nothing much can be done by the outside world in terms of Venezuela. Let's talk a little bit about North Korea as well, though, because we reflect a lot about further testing of ballistic missiles. At the time of this conversation today, we're awaiting a UN Security Council vote that's due later on Saturday on a resolution to strengthen sanctions against the country. The resolution has been drafted by the US, it says, with a lot of negotiation, following a lot of negotiation with China. And Michael, we've seen Rex Tillerson out in the region as well. What is your take on North Korea and what might happen, whether more sanctions can ever make a difference?
I don't think, from what we know of life in North Korea, you can pile another 100,000 sanctions on it, and the regime and its close acolytes will survive, and the people will continue in their lives. I think that, I hate to go back to Trump, but one
I
of the
spoke too soon, didn't I? Trying to suggest that.
One of the things about the whole North Korea thing is that we're paying attention because they claim to have developed ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that could deliver a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon, to the United States, to the continental United States. They haven't tried it. They haven't tested it that far, but this is what we're hearing, and that's why suddenly everybody's paying attention. I think that we're obsessed with Trump, and he has created his own reality. But there is another reality that covers the whole planet, and I do think that when it comes to North Korea, I think that China and Russia are the people. They are the governments that really will be the crucial ones. I think that, as we've seen if we've learned one thing from this 6 months of the Trump presidency, it's that he blusters. He makes big talks and speeches in front of his supporters. But in the end, much of his program never comes into being. And I think that we'll find that with foreign policy as well. I think that's a danger, because somebody somewhere will make a miscalculation that the United States won't respond. But I think that in the case of North Korea, the fact that a few weeks ago China completely reinforced its border all along the Yalu River, I think that this is a sign about who really we should be looking at to control that situation. And I suppose we'll be very curious to see what happens with this UN Security Council resolution, just to read it and parse it through. Not that Security Council resolutions mean anything in the long run anyway.
Brian?
There's no doubt that President Trump is as ill-equipped to deal with North Korea as he is with Venezuela. And as David points out, there's no future in sanctions in North Korea any more than there is in Venezuela, because
they haven't worked in the past.
It hasn't worked in the past. It's not like to work now. It will hurt ordinary people more than anything else. There is, I suppose, some comfort to be drawn from Rex Tillerson's remarks.
When he said, we are not your enemy.
We are not your enemy, but we are being threatened by what you are doing. But the route, as Michael says, to some sort of resolution is through Beijing, not the way that Donald Trump is talking to Beijing.
Well, and the administration has said that, hasn't it, time and again, that is indeed the route as it sees it.
Yeah, well, I think the whole point about North Korea is that it doesn't think in line with the West. It is a pariah state with a significant arsenal. And for that reason, precisely, it needs to be taken extremely seriously, because it is so unpredictable. Now, of course, there's always a temptation for Trump, as an incumbent president, to try to resolve, let's say, niggling situations as the North Korea. I mean, the big one is usually Israel-Palestine, but North Korea is never far off. And he's got the usual presidential options, ranging from negotiations to increased military action, or indeed doing nothing at all and leaving the problem for his successor to worry about. But I wouldn't, I would hope that Trump is not encouraged to escalate the situation.
Well, I mean, I was talking to a former UN ambassador earlier who says sanctions will do nothing. It's got to be about talking. It's got to be about diplomacy. That is the only route here.
Yeah, I mean, the essential problem is that the only government that can really affect things in North Korea, China, is more worried about the possibility of the demise of the regime and its replacement by a pro-Western regime than it is worried at the moment by the level of sabre-rattling going on from the Kim government. I'm sure it talks about both sides of that worry, by the way. I mean, I'm sure that in China, they talk about what will happen actually if he does overstep the mark and if things get too dangerous, what it is that they will do. But whilst that remains their basic calculation, you have to assume that the only way you can deal with this is by having the Chinese talk the North Koreans down and then having the Chinese being aware and themselves believing that there could be a point at which their own calculation would change, and having some idea about what that point would be. And that in the end is what it's all about. You can't invade the place. You could bomb large parts of it, but as we all know, as we've been reminded time and time again, the capacity of the North Koreans to hit the capital, the South Korean capital, and populated areas which are very close to the border is so rapid and great that the chances that you'd be able to completely knock it out before that happened are slim. Now, of course, if that calculation changes, then maybe the other calculations will change.
And that's through conventional artillery. I mean, not just, the ballistic missiles. That's why it's a horrendously fraught situation.
Yes. Well, let's close our programme on entirely different matters, because here in the UK this week, you may know that Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, officially retired at a mere 96. He was the guest of honour at a special Buckingham Palace ceremony hosted by the Royal Marines. As the Prince left, they played "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Many people, of course, now have to work well beyond the old retirement age. Is he, frankly, setting the tone for all of us? David, I think you've been writing about staying on longer, working longer, and we're all going to have to do it. All of us sitting around this table. I'm not sure any of us would be wanted on television at the age of 96.
But 90, yes, a niche television channel for 100-year-olds. At that point, it's one of the reasons why I like to go swimming in Florida, because they're all fatter than me. Yes, that would be quite nice, and there's an idea, and if anybody adopts it, then I have the copyright on it. Cue endless bits of patronising of 90-year-olds and so on in everywhere, as we say, good on you and so on. I think we even followed a little bit of that that happened on the, and it's all kind of it's good. It is nice, obviously, and it's good to think, especially as you enter. What would you describe us as being in, Michael?
I'm not going to say
not
what
midwinter.
We live in. You
early autumn. the early autumn. It's nice to think that that there was still
like
cakes and ale to
fourth
come.
decade, David. Really, no. The thing is that this is an important subject, because we keep hearing, as you said, Jane, we have to work longer. Would somebody please tell employers that we have to work longer? Yeah. Because there's nothing like the scythe of death that comes across a newsroom the minute somebody hits 50. And that's just our business. I mean, across the world, people who are in employment. I mean, Philip worked in the family firm. If you're in the family firm, you can work as long as your children are willing to let you. Look,
but if you write or you're on the radio, presumably you can too, I think.
Well, yes, but I mean, most people actually are in salaried employment.
Yes,
and if we're all having to work longer, employers better learn that they have to keep us on longer. Yes. And what happens, of course, is if they fire enough of us, as we've seen in the US, and we will see it in the statistics here in the UK, life expectancy begins to go back to the old days. People are dying sooner in certain demographics in America, primarily because they've been laid off and they can't find other employment. So it isn't all that perfect. And somebody should also tell the boys in Silicon Valley, all those smart 28-year-olds, to stop inventing robots that will put us all out of work anyway.
And that experience counts for a lot.
I tell my daughter that every day.
And I mean, David, you were alluding to the fact that we've been running a piece on the BBC today about a 93-year-old gentleman who is just retiring finally from his job in a supermarket.
What a name, Reg Buttress, for that particular role. You couldn't have. If I was writing a novel with a 93-year-old character in a supermarket, I'd have called him Reg Buttress, good luck to him.
All power to him for working to 93. And you could tell one of the things he loved was but just, of course, being out chatting to people in a supermarket setting every day. Would you aspire to that?
The key to staying in work is self-employment, and the ultimate self-employment is to be working in the family firm, which is what Prince Philip has been doing. But years ago, if you remember, years ago, the Queen, when the Queen Mum reached 80 and 90 and everything else, I remember my poor mother saying, "Well, she does look great, but I'd look that good if I hadn't washed a cup in my life." So,
yes, I mean, I do agree, and that's why I think that I certainly don't think that the royal family can set the norm for anything, because they are absolutely abnormal people. They are quite literally a quite extraordinary group of people who live in utter luxury in return for some rather pleasant social activity. And this is
some quite boring social activities, I would argue, actually, on some occasions.
This is
I
hardly...
wouldn't do that job.
No.
Would you? I don't think you would.
No, and I mean, this is hardly heavy lifting, and this is certainly not real work, especially if you consider...
I think the Queen did a very good job in 2011 when she came to Ireland, and it was much appreciated in Ireland, you know, and a lot of people in Ireland changed their view of the British royal family through that royal
Well,
visit.
I think the Queen has been quite a magnificent public servant, but I do think that, you know, the younger royals could certainly take example from her. They seem to be they are quite literally have quit their military careers already, and they seem to be far more interested in endless holidays and chillaxing.
I think you will find, Nabila, that he has stopped his career as a rescue helicopter pilot because he's going to do full-time royal duties. That is the point.
Well, as I said, this is hardly heavy lifting, especially if you put it in the context of how incredibly hard people have to work nowadays. You know, people go into offices very early in the morning. 12 hours a day is the norm. Shorter holidays as well, especially in anywhere, but it's in the West, and indeed in countries including Britain, and certainly, you know, in countries like America, which is certainly, you know, one of the hardest working countries I've ever lived in.
And Michael, basically, you hit the nail on the head, because the point is employers have, given that we will all need to keep earning, are going to have to find jobs for us all.
Well,
or keep us on in the first place.
Somebody's going to have to find jobs for a lot of people if people are going to be expected to work. When they're raising the pension age here to 68, and it will be 70 by the time, you know, the people who just entered the workforce are finished, and it will be higher still.
Exactly.
So, and you know, people do have to realize they have to change. This to be serious after we've been lighthearted. 3 words: there's work, there's jobs, and there's employment. It's employment that we don't have. Work, everybody can find work.
Do you think when the robots take over, the older robots will be all put out of work by the younger robots?
You saw Wall-E, didn't you? Did you see that cartoon?
Exactly.
Wall-E?
This is kind of what worries me, that the old wise robots will be slung out by the new kind of very shiny robots.
Well, until they invent 5 robots to replace all of us, we'll question how long that might take. But anyway, hopefully we'll all be back for the next few weeks at least. Thank you very much to all of you. Good to see you. Thank you very much, and enjoy your summer holidays if you're managing to escape on one. Thank you very much. That is just about it for this week here on Dateline London. Do join us again next week if you possibly can. Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.